Good evening, and welcome to the Rick Steves Europe 2025 Travel Festival. We are so happy you're here. My name is Emily Burks, and I am delighted to be your moderator this evening. Tonight, our tour program manager, Robyn Stencil, is back to cover a country with enough worthwhile destinations to fill an entire lifetime of travel, Italy. Tonight, Robyn will be sharing her candid takes on Italy's top destinations, as well as some alternatives to consider if you'd like to get off the beaten path. Please join me in welcoming Robyn back to the Travel Festival. Robyn, welcome back. How are you doing?
Thanks, Emily. I'm glad to be back. It's just a week later.
Yes, well, thank you so much for joining us once again and sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge from all your guidebook research. And to start things off, I was wondering if you could tell us about your first trip to Italy.
Yeah, great. Well, it was kind of a surprise. I was actually studying German at University of Washington and decided that I should spend a quarter studying English in Rome. So I went on a study abroad through the University of Washington's Rome Center. And during that program, I got to do weekly field trips with the program around the country of Italy. So in one quarter, I feel like I got a pretty good overview of the entire country. I learned a little bit of Italian and I got to know all the important things about being a Roman in Rome.
Amazing. Do you remember any of that Italian today as you
Oh
still
yeah, definitely.
practicing?
Like I said, I studied German in college, so learning Italian was very different. And I remember having to learn, like, the first number I had to learn was my address. I was living at 55 San Giovanni in Laterano, 55 San Giovanni in Laterano, and it was like, whew, that was hard. Coming from German, that was hard. But yeah, definitely I remember some still.
Oh, I bet that comes in handy when you do guidebook research. All
Definitely.
right. Well, I think I will turn things over to you, Robyn, and I'm so excited to see what you've prepared for us.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's really good to be back. Normally, I'm not sharing about Italy. We have so many Italian experts on the Rick Steves Europe team. I'm usually assigned to something more Germanic or Iberian, but I'm really happy to be back. And like I said, from my very first trip to Italy, I was really hitting all of the high points, all of the major cities. And on those weekend adventures, we were also doing excursions to places that I'd never dreamed about or seen in person, or even in some regards knew about. And that's kind of the topic of tonight's theme. I'm going to be running through Italy, some of the main places that you can go and see, and how to understand the expectations of what you will enjoy or want to avoid while you're there, and hopefully also some alternative ideas of how you can enjoy those places, even if they are just altogether brand new locations that you've never heard of, that can be good alternatives for what you're thinking about planning for your vacation. And right away, just to say that there are no right or wrong answers to how you spend your vacation. The most important investment you can make after a good guidebook is taking the time to really examine what you want to get out of your trip, and then find the places where you can match your hopes and dreams with the realistic expectations of what you can find in those places. So that's kind of the goal of tonight's show. And with that, we will get started in Venice. Our adventure starts off in Venice. And as a reminder, the shape of Venice, we like to say, is a fish, with the train station at kind of the head or the mouth of the fish, and the Santa Elena Gardens at the tail. I'd like to put this slide up here to remind you just how large the city of Venice is, because roughly 99% of all travelers spend their time between Rialto Bridge and St. Mark's Square, which I have circled here. And it's kind of a shame because Venice has so much more to offer. And the reality is, it is a really crowded city to go visit, especially when the cruise ships are in port. And that gauntlet that I just showed you between Rialto and St. Mark's Square is the busiest, most people-packed, unpleasant quarter mile of the entire city. So the number one thing I say when people are planning their trip to Venice is get lost. Go beyond that gauntlet. Okay, you're not really going to get lost. It's an island. You can't actually get off of the island. But what I mean by that is take the time to wander those back lanes. In fact, our groups do that when they're on tour with us, and the local guides love showing our groups lesser trafficked, lesser known neighborhoods in Venice because they're all tired of the crowds between Rialto and St. Mark's. And there's just such a noticeable difference between when you get off those main streets and off of those campos or those squares. And this campo is Giacomo near the Ferrari Church. And when you see that and then compare it to the main squares and the sites and the streets, which are always busy with people coming and going, and they're pretty much all trying to get into those same places, you really come to appreciate getting away from the crowds. By all means, please, by whatever means possible, avoid wandering between that gauntlet of the Rialto Bridge and St. Mark's Square, especially between, about 10 and 2 p.m. But the more you can get away from there, the better. Make your goal to get off those squares and explore those outlying neighborhoods. And I'm going to talk about two in particular that I particularly like. They're circled here, so we'll get going with those. The first one is called Cannaregio. This part of Venice is more residential and therefore more local. It's the farthest neighborhood away from St. Mark's Square, and fittingly, it's the most populated with year-round residents, and it gives a unique and authentic character. And actually, both Cannaregio and Castello, which I'll talk about in a moment, they have a lot more character just in general for those reasons. And it's partly because Cannaregio isn't on the way to anything. You actually have to make it a point and make it a destination in itself. It's one of the quieter parts of the city. It feels slower, partly because there's no finish line. Your only point is just wandering around. You're barely off of the main street, but it feels like a world away with fresh laundry hanging out to dry and people simply just going about their daily tasks. Cannaregio was also mostly a working class neighborhood until it became the Jewish ghetto in the 16th century. And while the gates came down after Napoleon defeated the city in the 18th century, it still remains home to a thriving Jewish community with a handful of synagogues and centuries of history. Well worth making this destination a part of your itinerary. By far, my favorite area in Venice is that Castello district, specifically the Garibaldi and Santa Elena Gardens. It's the largest neighborhood in the city and probably the least known or least visited. Those who do know about it are rewarded with historic landmarks like the Arsenale seen here. It's a collection of former shipyards and armories that you can visit, as well as pockets of neighborhoods and many squares and parks. And similar to Cannaregio, it's quiet, residential, and gives you a more modern look at daily life in Venice. This wide street here is the Via Garibaldi, and it was actually once a canal, filled in and now enjoyed by residents every day. It's kind of hard to see, but in this picture on the right-hand side, you see that glassed-in building. That's actually a cafe, Cafe di Sera, and it's a great place to meet for coffee, and you'll only be surrounded by locals. And at the top of the square, you can barely make it out, but trust me, there's a big piazza, Piazza Garibaldi, and it has a great fountain. And the cool thing about that fountain is it's home to a family of turtles, which is just kind of fun to see in the heart of Venice. But you can really feel how local this area is when you wander its back streets, and that includes the nearby rare surviving floating produce market. And it's really a joy to visit this in the morning when it's at its liveliest. Now, as a bonus neighborhood worth considering, I'm going to talk about the Dorso d'Oro, which is behind the Accademia Bridge here. That wooden bridge spans the Grand Canal, and on the other side of it, you'll find the Accademia Museum. But if you wander just a little bit further beyond the Accademia Museum, you'll find the Guggenheim Museum, which is this canal-side mansion that was actually lived in by Peggy Guggenheim. And now you can visit the collection of modern art, or for something a little bit different, wandering around the streets behind it where you find colorful buildings and lots of galleries. It's definitely worth getting out of the tourist crush to visit on a free afternoon. We're talking about alternatives today, and I know it's sacrilegious to say skip St. Mark's Square, which of course, it's a beautiful campo bursting with life, especially at night. And actually, I would say it's most worth visiting at night when you can hear the live music, enjoy a Campari soda, and just soak in the ambiance of Venice. But in particular, St. Mark's Basilica, which is known for its famous gold mosaics. That's what I want to talk about here. If you want to be blown away by mosaics, you could instead think of alternatively going to Ravenna to visit the Mausoleum Galla Placidia or the San Vitale. both with brilliantly preserved mosaics. I talked a little bit about this with my with Cameron last week when we talked about trends and challenges, but it's the idea that instead of saying, I want to go to Venice, now what is there to go do and see? Think about what do you want to go do and see, in this case, mosaics, and then start researching the best places you can see them. So this is one of those examples that if you're really into mosaics, consider going to Ravenna. Or I'll talk a little bit later about a place you can go visit in Rome. All right, and as far as gondolas go, let's talk a minute about the reality between the romance and the reality of taking a gondola ride. It can seem really romantic and something that's a must do on top of all of the must do lists when you're visiting Venice. The reality is, most companies take the same route. You're never really on your own, and you're basically gawked at by bystanders taking photos of you. And then you may end up on a short stretch of the Grand Canal, but in reality, you're sharing it among a bunch of vaporettos at the same time. So there's nothing wrong with doing it, but understanding what an alternative could be, where instead you could go visit a workshop where they actually make the gondolas and you can see from the outside how they do that. This one is in the Dorsodoro neighborhood near the Accademia, but there are actually special atelier workshops that you can go in and peek at the master in action. They basically make the adornments for the gondolas here. So like the oar locks or the kind of the tail flutes that you see decorating the gondolas. So it's just a different way to appreciate the history and the tradition of gondola making without being overwhelmed by sharing an experience with a bunch of strangers. And by the way, I should plug here, most of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight are covered in our guidebooks. As Emily mentioned, we're giving away the Italy guidebook. And for more in-depth coverage, we also have the Venice book, the Florence book, and the Rome book. And coming next November, we're going to have the very first new edition of the Naples and Amalfi Coast book. In addition to our guidebooks, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about tonight are covered by our audio walking tours, which is a walking tour through a city or a site narrated by Rick. So it's like having Rick in your ear. It's free to download, and more information is on our website about the Rick Steves Audio Europe tours. So Emily, that is just a little bit of an introduction about Venice. I know we have a lot more to cover, but what do you think so far?
Yeah, well, I have to say, the first place I ever went in Europe actually was Venice. So the first place I touched down, and actually, got to walk around. And I do remember being super jet lagged. And because of that, I was out very early. And yeah, I got to see San Marco Square with nobody in it. And so I loved your point about, taking advantage of those times where there's fewer crowds. And would you say that's, true of, any travel, really?
Yeah, and for sure in Venice because you have so many people commuting back and forth for work. But if you can get out before 8 a.m. and even on the other side of the Rialto Bridge, like the market when they're setting up the market over there, or like you said, St. Mark's Square, like that is the absolute best time you can go and have it basically all to yourself.
Yeah, I think it really makes a world of difference. And it's also amazing when you see it just totally quiet after just the chaos of
Oh,
the
the
afternoon.
fog or the sunrise. Yeah, it's very mystical. It can be a lot of fun. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the important thing here to know is that yes, it can be crowded and it can be overwhelming, but you can find those ways to make it a little bit more your own experience.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And just because a place may be crowded, it's still worthwhile going. You just have to have the right expectations.
Exactly. Well, moving on from Florence, I'm sorry, moving on from Venice, we are going to Florence, which is the birthplace of the Renaissance, another well-worthy city to visit, full of history and marvels. And it's just absolutely incredible to think that in one fully packed day, you could see Michelangelo's David in the Accademia Museum, Botticelli's Primavera, the birth of spring, along with the greatest collection of Italian paintings anywhere in the Uffizi Gallery, Ghiberti's bronze Gates of Paradise on the baptistry, Brunelleschi's famous dome atop the cathedral, the first dome built since ancient Rome. There's just so much art and history packed into its main axis, similar to Venice, everything is so compact. Within like a 15-minute walk, you can see all of those sites. In fact, in this photo, you can see the Duomo Dome and you can see the Palazzo Vecchio's tower, which is the Accademia Museum, the Uffizi Museum, just to give you an idea of how close those things are. And similar to Venice, you can imagine that in that gauntlet or in that main axis, it's extremely crowded. And for a reason, Florence is very popular. Making reservations at the Uffizi, the Accademia, and the Duomo are absolutely mandatory for travelers. Otherwise, you'll end up spending more time staring at the outside walls than you will staring at the artwork on the inside of the buildings. And if your goal is to see Michelangelo's sculptures, you can consider skipping the David in favor for the Medici chapels, which feature the tombs of the royal family, completely decked out by statues almost exclusively created by Michelangelo. Or you can wait to visit Rome and St. Peter's and Chains Church to see his Moses statue, which was intended for the unfinished tomb of Pope Julius II. But we'll talk about that later when we get to Rome. And if you want to see other versions of David and other historic masterpieces by Renaissance sculpture, at the Bargello, featuring the works by Michelangelo, Cellini, and Giambologna, among others, you can see Donatello's David, which was the first male nude to be sculpted in 1,000 years. It set the artistic style for many who followed. And in some ways, you could almost argue that it's more impressive and more important than the more famous Michelangelo's David. Or if it's paintings you're after, a great swap for the Uffizi Gallery could be the Museum of San Marco, featuring the greatest collection anywhere by Renaissance master Fra Angelico. Or Santa Maria Novella, where the chapels trace art from Florence from medieval times to early Baroque, including the textbook example of early Renaissance mastery of perspective, the Trinity Masaccio. And of course, there's much more to do and see in Florence besides art and Renaissance. You're in the heart of Tuscany. Here, cuisine is king, and there are plenty of ways you can experience it, from cooking classes to extravagant meals to after dinner gelatos. And if food is king, wine is queen. Whether it's an aperitivo in Florence, a day trip to a vineyard, make sure you take time to enjoy the culinary wonders in and around Florence. In fact, a dozen or more hill towns offer options for skipping Florence altogether to favor the settling into an Italian countryside for peace, quiet, and that famous Tuscan cuisine. In this map of Tuscany, you can see Florence in kind of the upper portion and so many other hill towns that are here that are all purposely made for just slowing down, relaxing, enjoying all of those things. And a lot of them you already know about. They range in popularity from the booming Siena with the best square in Italy, to San Gimignano and its towers, to Montepulciano, known for its wine. And there are also some relatively unknown towns like quaint Lucca with its ramparts, to the refreshingly real Volterra with its Etruscan roots and grand fortress, or Pienza's tidy, tranquil Renaissance burg and beautiful surrounding countryside. So really, if Italian Renaissance art isn't what gets you moving, or it's not what you're passionate about, you could consider relocating from Florence to the countryside, where an Italian villa or an agriturismo, which is a farmhouse, would be more than happy to welcome you for peaceful respite during your vacation.
Thank you, Robyn. I actually didn't get to eat dinner before this, and all of your talk of food and wine has got me pretty hungry. But yeah, we definitely have quite a few questions in the chat already. And Carl W. is actually going to Rome and Florence, and he was wondering, how do you find different offbeat things to do while you're traveling, and maybe particularly in those cities?
Yeah, well, I keep my eyes up. I know that sounds kind of silly, but I'm always, whenever I'm wandering through town, whether I know the town or not, I just kind of have this sense, and I watch where the local people are going and I kind of check that out. And oftentimes I can tell if a lot of local people are going in there, or if it's like the right time of day and it's super busy, super crowded. If oftentimes if the menu isn't exactly in English, or if there's like it's predominantly in Italian or the local language, that's when I want to circle and come back to.
I love it. And I love that you mentioned menus because I know for me at least, if there are pictures of the food on the menu, that typically means run. Run
Yeah,
the other
yeah.
way. So
I am a little bit wary of any restaurant or any place that says that they have the best or any kind of superlative of anything. It might be true, but I mean, those are ones that I kind of steer away from. And yeah, I just kind of would rather follow like the local flow and see where they end up.
I will definitely be following that advice on my next trip. Thank you.
You bet. All right, well, we've tackled two big cities already. Now it's time to move to Rome, and then we'll circle around to some coastal destination hotspots. But for now, Rome, is the eternal city. And Rick likes to say Rome is magnificent and overwhelming all at the same time, and I would definitely agree. Rome has always been crowded. It's always been a melting pot since the Roman Empire. And I like to think and imagine if it's this crowded now, what did it feel like, almost 2000 years ago at the peak of the Roman Empire? Like how crowded or how dense would that have felt? And the other thing that I love to do when I'm in Rome is I just have to stop and think about the steps that I'm taking, like who in history or how many people have traveled those same steps, and it just kind of makes me stop and gives me like a moment of awe. Or a simplistic way to think about it is Rome is kind of part ancient and part religious. It's kind of layered with all of these tangled ruins and bygone cultures or civilizations. It has a lot of grand squares and beautiful fountains, but it's also full of modern life. It wasn't a city that was ever destroyed and rebuilt where the past was kind of erased. It's truly a living city where a local guide likes to explain it. I think this makes so much sense that Rome is like a lasagna. It's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer that ends up in this beautiful dish of discovery. It's an absolutely vibrant city and it's magnificent and well deserving of your visit, especially delightful at night. And I think this is a theme that we're going to see through the rest of my presentation, and you should just carry it with you whenever you're planning a trip to Europe. There's just something spectacular at night, especially when the floodlit fountains and the monuments are lit up. But it also is kind of like this golden hour of when the crowds start to recede and the locals start to come out, and it kind of takes on like a second life or like a second persona that I really love. That's not to say it's not without its challenges, and perhaps the biggest challenge that Rome faces for 2025 is crowds. There's going to be significantly more people in Rome during the Jubilee year. And really, that just means you need to decide whether you want to wait until next year, 2026, or if you want to take advantage of everything that Rome's been doing, all of the cleaning and the rejuvenation and the renovation that they've been doing to get ready for this big Jubilee year. And then just, partake in the celebrations. It's important to say that pilgrims who visit Rome during Jubilee year typically spend most of their time in the Vatican City. So while it will be crowded, it's going to be more noticeably crowded in and around St. Peter's and the Vatican Museum. And we really think that it's probably just going to be like the normal amount of crowds outside of the Vatican, but it's still a little bit too early to tell. The other thing we're thinking about is looking at what happened in France and the Olympic year, where people kind of stayed away because they were worried about how crowded it would be for the Olympics. And now in 2025, everyone's kind of going back to France. That's the trend that we're seeing. So it might not be a bad year to go to Rome if a lot of people are purposefully staying away for the most part because of Jubilee. But that said, even in a normal year, the Vatican Museum can be a mob scene. Reservations are absolutely mandatory, and I hate to break it to you, but you're not going to get much relief on the inside of the museum either. And that's because it's sort of this IKEA style one-way route that everyone is headed to the same place, which is the Sistine Chapel. And obviously, there's no replacement for the Grand Sistine Chapel, but it doesn't mean that you have to have FOMO if you decide to skip it. And again, this is something that I talked about in our class last week with Cameron. is the concept that just because something is famous doesn't mean that you'll necessarily be moved by it. Um, Especially in this case, in the Sistine Chapel and the Vatican Museum, some people are so overwhelmed by the atmosphere and the crowds and what it takes to get there that they end up being kind of underwhelmed by seeing the Sistine Chapel at the end of it all. So really consider and focus on like why you want to see it and what is the purpose that you want to see. Otherwise, you may find yourself in that kind of overwhelmed and underwhelmed category. And the same can kind of be said about St. Peter's. There's absolutely no denying that it's the most impressive church in Italy. In fact, Rick thinks it's the most impressive church on earth. And it is going to be crowded for Jubilee, but there's just something that's so beautiful about this church that you almost don't mind how crowded it is. You will need to go through a security checkpoint, which can add a little bit of time to your visit, but it doesn't seem as cramped or as crowded as the Vatican because you're kind of out in the square, out in the open. It just kind of takes a little more time. And whether you're Christian or not, and even with the crowds, it's just hard not to be moved when you're inside such a magnificent facade, magnificent church. But that said, there are also plenty of other moving sites in Rome. For example, St. Peter's in Chains, which I kind of touched on earlier, but this was built to house the chains of St. Peter. And it also features Michelangelo's Moses, which I had mentioned. It was meant to be on top of Pope Julius II's tomb, which was never finished. So that kind of connection of St. Peter's, the chains that held St. Peter, and then the Moses make this church a little gem in the heart of Rome, not far away from the Colosseum. And I always suggest that people go here because when you're up close with that Moses statue and you realize that there was supposed to be like 42 of these statues on top of the tomb, it just gives you a different kind of perspective of how grand that tomb would have been had it ever been finished. Another option is St. Paul's outside the walls, and it's actually technically part of the Vatican Church. It's on the southern edge of the city, and according to the Christian tradition, St. Paul was buried here. And people got really excited in the early 2000s when forensic experts declared basically that the bones that were buried here did come from possibly the first or second century. So it just kind of reignited the faith that you would have when you walk into this church that possibly St. Paul was buried there. And the other thing to note here is it does have a 13th century mosaic filling that dome that was likely done by the same craftsman who did the dome in St. Mark's in Venice. So there's that connection there. Again, you don't necessarily have to go to St. Mark's in Venice to see great mosaics. But possibly the most moving experience I've ever had in Europe wasn't even in a church. Last May, when I was researching the guidebook, the Rome guidebook, I visited the Catacombs of Priscilla in northern Rome, and you can only visit by a guided tour, and that's mainly because they don't want you to like go down in the catacombs and get lost on your own. But the most impressive or the most moving part to me was when you're down there and you're thinking about like New Testament Bible stories, they're 2,000-year-old stories now. But when you're inside these catacombs, you realize that those stories that they were telling or those stories that they depicted on the walls were 100, 200 years old, one or two generations old. And it just puts you in this frame of reference of what the present meant to them at that time. And I know this photo is a little bit blurry, but it also houses the earliest known representation of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. So when you go there, you don't actually get to see the original because they want to preserve it, but they have this great kind of example on the outside, and they talk about the people who came and worshiped there and why it was meaningful and what it was used for. And again, it's just one of those examples that something doesn't have to be famous to be moving to you. You never know, like, what else is out there that might give you a very meaningful experience, even if it's not a marquee site or a famous place to see. Well, moving on to the ancient part of the city of Rome. Recently, Rick gave a blanket permission for you to skip the interior of the Colosseum, and it felt very sacrilegious, and even to think about skipping just seems so wrong. But when you understand how chaotic it is to get inside, this is film of me from May when I was researching the guidebook. The lines to get inside the Colosseum were just mind blowing that people wait in line in this crowd to go see the inside. And really, half of the thrill is seeing the Colosseum from the outside, which is free and easy anytime. And really, it may not appeal to you as much as an alternative site like the Baths of Caracalla, where you can wander in roomy comfort and get a sense of the immense size and the ingenuity of Roman engineering. And then you don't feel so bad about skipping the interior of the Colosseum. Other examples of Roman engineering that are fascinating and not nearly as crowded as the Colosseum or the Forum. The new Forma Urbis Museum in Rome. This now houses a 3rd century map of Rome made out of marble. And they found this 3rd century map in the Forum in the 16th century. And why this is important, or why it's cool, is that they've been piecing together these slabs of marble to recreate the 3rd century map, and they've overlaid it with a 16th century map of Rome. And to see how precise and how little had changed between the 3rd century and the 16th century also gives you an idea of what the Roman Empire was about, and how they built things, and how relative and how current it still is today. Or consider visiting the Appian Way. This was the road that was built in 312 BC, and it was the road that connected Rome with Brindisi and Naples, the port towns. This is the original road that led to Rome, and the original cobbles, and you can still walk on them. And again, like, not crowded at all. And this is another one of those places where I think, who else trod this path? And also along the Appian Way, something really cool you can see is you can go past the ancient aqueduct, which of course brought the water into Rome. But now when you go there, instead of seeing the water being transferred, you see families out having a picnic or kids playing soccer. And it just, again, gives you that idea of like the lasagna of Rome, about how all of these generations and decades and centuries have been layered on top of one another. And now you just have modern day Roman families under ancient aqueducts. Oh, one last thing that I wanted to point out while I was researching last May, I found this company, the Live Virtual Guide Rome, and I didn't get to go on any of their tours, but they have an Instagram account, and I was having so much fun following their posts for little secret hideaway things, whether it was a site that I didn't know about or a good tip on food. I really got inspired to see how locals view living in Rome. And I would highly recommend, if you want to be inspired about other things to do or see in Rome, that you check out their Instagram account. And they do have tours, but like I said, I didn't actually get to try out the tour, so I don't know how that would be.
I am definitely going to follow this page. That is new to me, but I am taking my boyfriend to Italy on our South Italy tour, and he's never been. So I've got to definitely got to wow him. But Robyn, I was just wondering, a lot of the conversation tonight has been around making a personal connection while you're in a place that's very touristed. And I think a great way to do that would also be staying at a, locally run hotel or a small B&B. And I know that you recently stayed in a convent in Rome. And so I was wondering if you could share some details or highlights from that experience.
Yeah, that was a great experience. What a special thing to do. That one is in the Piazza Farnese, which is right around the corner from the Campo di Fiore, if you are familiar. It was the convent Suara Elisabetta. I don't know. It's in the book. But it was so peaceful. And I mean, in the middle, in the heart of everything, in the Campo di Fiore is a really bustling place day and night. But you literally just like go half a block and turn a corner, and you're just like in this heavenly oasis where nuns are shuffling around. It came with, I don't think I'm not sure what they're going to do for Jubilee year, but in normal years, they'll give you a ticket to go to like the papal audience. And they have this great breakfast room that really encourages all travelers to kind of come together and commune with one another. So as an alternative accommodation, I would highly recommend checking out convents in Rome. There are quite a few of them.
Very cool. I know this is different, but I've had good experiences renting a room on Airbnb from a woman. I just did it in London, and she was an artist, and she gave me a lot of really good recommendations, and it was just fun to feel like I had a connection on the ground in London then.
Yeah, exactly. I think whether it's a convent or Airbnb or like you said, a local hosting hotel or smaller bed and breakfast, um, take advantage of that and really ask them and get involved with them. That's what they're there for. And it just seems way more personal than staying at like a business style hotel where you're just kind of checking the boxes.
Yeah, 100%. It's just so much more immersive.
All right, well, we are moving out of the cities and we're gonna hit a couple coastal regions now. I was putting this show together and I was asking myself, like, why are some places popular and other places aren't as popular? And I think what I came to understand is that, places can become really popular because they're unique and they're beautiful and they're different than what we're used to. And that's kind of why we want to see them. And I think that's been true about, even just Venice, Florence, and Rome. They're all really unique cities and definitely different than the architecture that I see in my daily life around Seattle. And this is also the same for the Cinque Terre. The Cinque Terre was a series of 5 former fishing villages along the Italian Riviera. And they dot the coastline from north to south, and they're connected by some moderate hiking trails. But really, they were independent fishing villages that were just eking out an existence. And now they've just been this discovered place that, oh, if you are you going to the Cinque Terre? Have you been to the Cinque Terre? Didn't you love the Cinque Terre? And it's just fascinating. But I understand it because they're just so unique and so different than anything that we're used to. From the north, you have Monte Rosso, which is the largest of the villages. It has kind of two sides of the town, the old town and the new town, and it has the largest and the best beach. For Nozza, with the iconic viewpoint, I'm sure you've seen this in at least somewhere, overlooking the harbor with the ruined castle on top. And this is what Rick considers kind of the gem of the region. Cornelia, with fewer tourists, mainly because it's only accessible by train or trail or bus. It doesn't have a harbor of its own. Manarola, which is surrounded by vineyards and it has lots of little cute shops to poke around in. And then at the end, Rio Maggiore, which kind of feels like, to me at least, it feels the most lived in. And, a lot of the charm of these places that they're very time warped and they're colorful and they have this feeling of relative isolation. But in reality, they're not really that isolated anymore. As they've grown in popularity, there are times when it can feel just bursting at the seams. And that's especially true when day trippers are really excited to squeeze all 5 villages into one short excursion. And that's the reality you get when your village literally cannot grow or isn't large enough to meet the demand or the capacity of the people who are coming. And it's not that the Cinque Terre isn't a beautiful place to go. You're lucky if you've been there 10 years ago when maybe it wasn't so crowded. It's just that they're inundated and at capacity. And as a traveler, that might cause you to get overwhelmed or frustrated with crowds that are clogging the streets or, sharing one main beach across all the people and all the 5 villages, or, the trails where you have hikers of all ages and abilities. It can slow things down. But really, there's 2 ways to kind of overcome this. Either you stay the night and be rewarded with beautiful sunsets and the receding crowds that I kind of hinted at earlier. Or, while there's no replacing the Cinque Terre or that kind of destination, you could consider a lesser known, lesser crowded alternative nearby, like Levanto. It's technically outside of the 5 villages of the Cinque Terre, but it's only a 10-minute train ride to Monterosso. And it has its own gorgeous, large, expansive beach. And it has a ton of charming hotels and local restaurants where you might be able to get a room where you can't in the high season during the Cinque Terre. And in my opinion, it also has the best hike in all of the region. My favorite hike in the Cinque Terre doesn't go to any of the 5 villages. It actually starts in Monterosso and then it heads up and over the headland to go to Levanto. It's a bit more of a challenge, but in all of the years that I've done it, I could count on less than 2 hands the number of travelers that I met or other hikers along the way. And when you compare that with just the amount of travelers or hikers on one stretch of the Cinque Terre, you really can appreciate what that trail is and having nature all to yourself. Another hidden gem is walking or taking a short bike ride, maybe 25 minutes, along the path from Levanto to the next town over, which is Bonasola. Most of the walk is really pleasant, flat through an old train tunnel. And actually, it was the original train line that linked Italy in the 1870s, right after the Risorgimento or the reunification of the country. Modern day, there is a train that will take you from Levanto to Bonasola, but it's a lot more fun to walk or to bike. And when you pop out of that train tunnel, it's so fun to look down, and you're right at the town's promenade with the main square and the beach and cute piazzas, and hardly any travelers or tourists visiting for the day. And the other option is going out to Sestri Levanti, which has a nice old town and a promenade and peninsula that's squeezed in between two beaches. And the benefit of being here is that you still get the feel of the Italian Riviera with everything it has going for it, but you're kind of missing those inlet hugging, cliff hugging villages. But if you're okay with that, it makes a great alternative where you still get to have that feel that you've been in the Italian Riviera. So, Emily, I don't know if you've ever gotten to go to the Cinque Terre yet, or if it's on your bucket list.
You know what? I did get to go in oh gosh, I think it was yeah, between my sophomore and junior year of college. So it's been a little while, but yeah, I really enjoyed it despite the crowds, but I love your point, especially earlier when you were saying just because a site is famous doesn't necessarily mean it will move you. And that's something that comes up a lot when people, in my other role here, working the phones, a lot of people I can tell feel like they have almost like a homework assignment, like a checklist of things to do. And I always encourage them, to take a step back and is it the Cinque Terre specifically, or do you just want to enjoy some nice seaside villages and maybe go for a swim? So yeah, I thank you for sharing those alternatives.
Yeah, you bet. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I think if you can kind of step back and hone in on what experience you want and then try to determine where is the best place that you can get it. It's just hard because all of these places are now, famous and crowded. And there's this kind of sense that like, oh, we want to go there because it's famous, or there's the opposite sense of like, oh, I don't want to go there because it's too famous. And I try to kind of stay out of that. I just sort of for myself think about like, how do I want to feel, or what do I want to do, or what do I want to experience, and then again, just try to find like the best place that's going to suit my expectations for that. But
Yeah.
we've got one more coastal region to talk about, which I'm excited to share with you. And that is the super popular Amalfi Coast, which is just south of Naples. You can see on this map, the most popular towns along the Amalfi Coast include Sorrento, which is kind of the transportation hub. You see the ferry lines there. It's also at the end of the Circumvesuviana train line that connects Naples with Sorrento, which is kind of the gateway of the area. Positano along the Amalfi Coast Drive, of course, is probably the best known thanks to social media, Instagram, and because it's beautiful. And then further east, you find the Amalfi town. And just beyond that, I've circled one other town that you probably have never heard of before. We'll talk about more about that one later for sure. It's called Minori. But about an hour south of Naples, like I said, you'll find Sorrento. And it can be an ideal home base for your time in the area. It has a really attractive resort town vibe, a great pedestrianized old town, lively streets. It has that cliffside setting that you kind of hope for or imagine when you think of the Amalfi Coast. It absolutely swells with tourists in the season. And as the gateway to the Amalfi Coast, as we saw on the map, it makes it a really practical choice over the other towns. But as a result, it can also kind of be more chaotic with all the people like coming and going all the time. The other benefit of staying in Sorrento is that from Sorrento, you can easily visit Pompeii, Paestum, and Capri Islands as day trips. I'm going to talk a little bit about Capri. It's very beautiful. It's definitely not for those who have a fear of heights, as the roads leading up to it are quite windy. And I think it was the most scared I've ever been on a bus, just looking down the straight cliffs and wondering what the driver was thinking. Um, if you can get over that, though, it's also a glitzy, commercialized, overcrowded destination, mainly catering to like big group tourism or big bus tourism. Really famous, of course, for the crowded Blue Grotto, which has become increasingly more expensive. I was talking to a colleague of mine who researched this book for us last year. And I was saying, yeah, what did you think about the Blue Grotto when you went? And she said, oh my God, it took 2 hours just to get there. And she said most of that time was waiting. Like you see these people in the boats waiting to get into the grotto. And she said that the company that she went with said, good luck if you arrive after 10:30 in the morning, it'll be more like a 3 or 4 hour excursion. And the end result of that is getting about 1 minute inside the grotto when you're not going to be really by yourself. To be fair, this photo doesn't really do it justice. The water is really spectacularly beautiful, and it's okay if you still want to go there. Everyone's motivated and excited and pleased by different things. The important thing to know is what you're going to get, and consider like, okay, is it, for what I want, is it worth doing this, or is there an alternative that I can do that would get me something similar or better than doing this one thing? Like she had suggested, doing a tour around the island could be a really spectacular way to spend those 3 hours. And I have one more other option coming up later that I'm happy to tell you about. A little bit further beyond Sorrento is Positano, and this is Rick's pick for the most scenic stretch and spectacular part of the Amalfi Coast. And what makes it special, of course, is the scenery and the beaches. It was positively made for strolling, and instead of a main town square, it really has a main town beach. We're starting to get the picture here. Anything this beautiful is going to come with crowds and popularity. And to give you an idea, Positano has about 4,000 residents year round, and every day between Easter and October, it sees about 12,000 visitors. So 3 times as many residents come every day to visit Positano. Thankfully, there's not quite as much of the big group, big bus tourism because the roads are a little bit too hard for those large coaches to navigate. So that gives it a slight advantage over Capri in that regard. But the downside, or the other hand, is that it's so extremely popular and increasingly expensive that it just kind of overwhelms you. And on top of that, there's very limited bus service for the same reason big buses don't go there. It's really hard for the local buses to get in and out. And definitely the demand for those local bus routes exceeds the supply. Oh my gosh, what am I trying to say? There are too many people who want to take those routes and not enough buses. So you'll really need to rely on the boat service, or you need to really plan well in advance to get in line and wait for that next bus service to come. Um, and while the beach is lovely, it's part sand and part pebbly, and it attracts a lot of worshippers who are happy to spend the afternoon there. Positano is really a classic example of a city that's better suited as an overnight destination instead of a day trip for all of those reasons. And not the least reason, the real magic of Positano again hits after dark with that beautiful lit up hillside of all the buildings, and you can really get that glimpse of the local flavor once all of the people are gone for the day. And then a little bit beyond Positano, you have Amalfi Town, which is probably the one that feels the most lived in, and it can have a much more attractive price tag than Positano for that reason. It's a nice balance. It has enough amenities and transportation connections here, but it doesn't quite have the picturesque beauty of Positano or the great direct gateway access of Sorrento, and that kind of can make it an attractive alternative to staying in Positano. It's still very bustling and vivacious, and there's plenty of big bus tours that make a stop here. So don't expect that you're going to see fewer crowds just because it's not quite as pretty. And like a lot of the towns that we're talking about along the Amalfi Coast, it's going to become its second persona, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, after those crowds disperse. So it really makes it worthwhile to overnight and stay and experience that. Oh, but here is the secret hidden gem, Minori. This is the town that I circled and mentioned you probably don't know anything about. It's not as famous as Sorrento or Positano, and it's a truly workaday backdoor town, about a 10-minute drive outside of Amalfi town. And while that might turn some travelers away, for others, it seems like the perfect antidote. And Rick has said, for about half the cost and a quarter to a half of the crowds, you'll double your enjoyment in this area by staying in a place like Minori. It's great for strolling. There's plenty of gelato shops. It's good for relaxing. It's easy to connect the other towns. And while it might not be as exotic as Positano or Amalfi, it has a better beach, a less crowded beach, and bonus, there is a lovely 45-minute hike between Minori and the sister town of Maori that's called the Path of Lemons. And it kind of mimics that concept that the Cinque Terre has of hiking between town to town, where you can connect the two and have a great vista over the coastline. And you can look for both towns to be included in the new upcoming edition of the Naples and Amalfi Coast book. So a little plug there. It should be coming out in November. And now I'm going to propose something totally different. You can consider going to a completely different coastal destination like the Gargano Peninsula on the Adriatic coast. So it's on the opposite coastline due east of Naples. It's a truly rugged coast and it's one of the most beautiful areas in South Italy, and it's still relatively unknown to American travelers. I was thinking about this and it kind of reminds me of the Mani Peninsula in Greece, not quite so well, the Mani Peninsula has some cities that have a lot of people still living there, so it's a little bit more populated than the Mani Peninsula, but again, it's not on the way to anywhere. It's like a destination all its own, and it's so authentic and like almost untouched by tourism. The entire peninsula is just dotted with sandy beaches and dramatic coastal towns, and has plenty of tourist facilities and interesting things to do. The area is known for its limestone cliffs and the famous kind of monolith there. This one is the Pizza Mugno, and it's just outside of Vieste. And those limestone cliffs also have hidden grottos and the most beautiful turquoise water that could easily compete with or overtake Capri. So like I said earlier, just kind of knowing what your alternatives are. Capri, expensive, crowded, and maybe not as, I don't know, engaging. If you were to instead go to Gargano Peninsula, you could still get that beautiful water. You could still get amazing caves and grottos with way fewer people, a better price point, and probably a better experience as well. And actually, the other thing the area is known for, and I don't have a photo of this, but it's really cool if you're ever there. It's dotted with these ancient fishing platforms that sort of look like a combination between a cabin and an oil rig. And it's where the fishermen would kind of drop their nets and cast for the day and then come back and collect whatever swam into their nets. They're called trabucchi. And it's nice because it kind of reminds people of the roots that this region had in fishing and agriculture, even though today people are going to, the sea is attracting people to come for different reasons. The town of Vieste is at the tip of the Gargano Peninsula, and it's nestled onto a cliff atop a really spectacular beach. It makes for a great home base. And in fact, this is the town that we use on our South Italy tour as our overnight stop. It's complete with whitewashed buildings, narrow lanes, a maze-like old town, steep staircases, basically everything you picture when you think of like old Italian South cultural things. It has a castle, it has a church, and a handful of other sites that you will find when you're wandering around. And like I said, it's still popular with Italians, mostly in July and August, but relatively unknown out to the outside world. And it certainly isn't as overrun as Positano or the other towns on the Amalfi Coast, or even the Cinque Terre, really, to be honest. So definitely worthy of checking it out to see if it's something that you might enjoy. So in closing, I know it can feel really exhausting when trying to decide where to go or where to plan your trip. And by the nature of modern tourism and social media, certain sites or destinations are famous, packed, and expensive, and others are peaceful, overlooked, and almost living in another reality. But being famous doesn't make a place or a thing better or worse. It just makes it better known and often more crowded. Sometimes those hole in the wall, happy accident, completely unknown places can become your favorite memory. And other times, seeing the painting or the monument you've waited your whole life to see will move you to tears. It's worth taking the time to kind of match your desires and your passions with your expectations of the places or the things that you want to see. And instead of expecting to love something simply because it's famous, make it a point to find something you already love. And in Italy, especially, there's no shortage of inspiration both within these places that we've talked about and beyond those well traveled roads. So, with that, I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm going to hand it back over to Emily, who's going to talk about the winner of the contest.
Thank you so, so much, Robyn, for that tour of Italy. And yes, I have the distinct pleasure of announcing tonight's giveaway winner. Drum roll, please. All right, it is Sheila P. from Mendota Heights, Minnesota. Congratulations, Sheila. We will be reaching out to you tomorrow over email with some more details about how we will get you your guidebook. All right, Robyn. Well, again, thank you so much for that tour of Italy. And I love that you mentioned the Gargano Peninsula because that is a place I am particularly excited about going on our South Italy tour this year. And now on to some questions. All right, Robyn. So we did get quite a lot of interest in the convent that you stayed in, and some people are wondering if there's any, limitations on who gets to stay in a convent. Do you have to be a woman? Do you have to be a Christian?
So, different ones have different rules. The one that I was in didn't have any restrictions. You were not required to be of any faith or any like gender. But I did think it was funny because I was tired after a long day of research, and I heard this group of people coming back, and they were like obviously just lit, and I was like, "You're staying in a convent. What are you doing?" So while there are probably some, general house rules, just, you probably want to have a little bit more modesty or a modicum of kind of, you know, self-control.
Certainly, and that is an interesting choice, seeing that there's probably dozens, if not hundreds, of hostels in Rome. Okay. Well, we have Kelly D is traveling to Rome with her parents this year. Her parents are in their 70s and they are worried about saving their energy for the sites. So they don't want to spend too much time walking around the city if they don't have to. Do you have any tips for getting around Rome efficiently?
Yeah, I mean, Rome is hard. Rome is hard to get around. Something that people don't often think about is that the streets in Rome are very uneven, and that just takes a different kind of energy in general to to stabilize your feet as you're walking along cobblestones or kind of uneven roads. And the other challenge is that every time they try to dig for like a new metro line or a new metro stop, they keep hitting more ruins. So the metro doesn't really get you to many places. I mean, it will get you to the Colosseum and it will get you to the Vatican or St. Peter's. And the other notoriously hard thing is that traffic is really bad. So even if you were to get in a taxi or get on a bus, the buses are going to be crowded. The taxis are going to take time because of traffic. So not to discourage you, but just to plan extra time because it's great to get, there's so many taxis, you can get anywhere you need to go, but just factor in a little bit more time because you're going to hit traffic.
Great, great. And jumping to Florence now. Dana R is wondering what neighborhood you might recommend to stay in if you want to still feel close in town but escape the crowds.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you could always stay in the Oltrarno neighborhood, which is the other side of the river, the Arno River. So that's opposite, the Uffizi and the Duomo and the Accademia, but it is more like a residential area. You have the Boboli Gardens over there and the Pitti Palace. That's a good neighborhood. The other area is kind of back by the market, like San Lorenzo Market, or back by the Accademia. Again, you're kind of outside of that main access, but you're still like within the city and easy walking distance to different places. But for something different, I would definitely check out the Oltrarno area.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know Florence actually is, I think, a bit more walkable than people real life.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, way more walkable than Rome. Probably the most walkable of the places that I covered, except for the little tiny villages. But yeah, really, literally everything is within like a 15-minute walk in Florence.
wonderful. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Um, so Denise, I know you did share some other Puglia wrecks with the Gargano Peninsula. Denise is wondering if you have any other wrecks.
Yeah, I mean, we do Matera as well in that area. Personally, I've been to Bari, and I think that's a great location as well. It's kind of an undiscovered corner of Italy, so you're not going to find it in a lot of guidebooks. But the nice thing about the internet and all of these, Instagram accounts is you probably will find really great references online if you just kind of Google it or search for it. Matera, I think, was like the I don't know, UNESCO World City or something like that recently. So I'm sure they have a lot of information online.
Thank you. And I also wanted to note our own Lisa Friend actually did a Monday Night Travel episode on her recent trip to Puglia. So if you want to check that out, you'll find it in the Monday Night Travel archive page. And it's, I think, a whole hour on Puglia. So that will be a great resource.
And that reminds me that you and I were talking earlier, and Monday Night Travel also did a destination duel between the Cinque Terre and the Amalfi Coast. So
Yes.
if you are aching for a little bit more than what I teased you with tonight, definitely go and check that in the archives as well.
Yes, thank you, Robyn, for reminding me of that. Okay, so we can finish these up soon. I have just a couple more questions for you, Robyn. I know you did go into this with the Jubilee in Rome, but Sharon S. is wondering if it really is a bad idea to go to Venice, Florence, or Rome in 2025. A lot of people are worried about mass tourism due to the Jubilee.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't worry about Venice and Florence at all. Reminder that Venice does have those access days, and we have an article about that on our website where if you're visiting for the day or staying overnight on certain days that they have predetermined, you need to register in advance. Don't panic. It's not that hard. If you're sleeping overnight in a Venice hotel, you don't have to pay any money. If you're visiting for the day, coming in just for the day, you do on those specific days, you do have to register and pay a small fee. Um, Florence, nothing really in particular to note about that. We have been going back and forth about Rome. I know Rick has said like, skip it, don't go. It's the Jubilee year. You might as well just stay until next year. We are still waiting to see kind of how it all plays out, because the difference between the Olympics and Jubilee year is that the Olympics in France last year was a 2-week window, a very dedicated time when everyone was going to be in the same place at the same time. Whereas Jubilee year, it spans the entire year. It started a month ago. So you have people coming and going the entire time. And in the past Jubilee years, most of that was concentrated within the Vatican City. So, we can't predict what the crowds are going to be like going into going into the high seasons of Jubilee year. Probably stay away during Easter. That would be a good idea. I probably would say, don't avoid Rome at Easter during a Jubilee year. But it was really crowded last May when I was there, and I think almost more people came because they were worried about Jubilee year. They wanted to get it out of the way. And or I think Rome is just a crowded place. And if you already know about yourself, you don't like crowds, it probably doesn't matter if it's a Jubilee year or not. You probably should be looking for alternative destinations. If you are someone who lives with crowds and lives with chaos and thrives on it, then this is like the perfect time to go. So it kind of we're still running all of our tours. We're not worried about anything. We're just gonna, make use of reservations and be efficient moving around as a group. And I think savvy travelers can do that and still enjoy time in Rome.
Very beautifully put, Robyn. Thank you. And just one more question. This one's for me, actually, just to cap the evening. I am curious if during your any of your recent Italy travels, if there was something that really surprised you in a good way.
Yeah, well, definitely that Catacombs of Priscilla like super surprised me. I was just blown away with that. For sure. And I loved the Via Appia. I loved those places where they're lesser known, or they're not the marquee sites, but when you give them a chance, they like blow you away. I felt the same way about the former Urbis. I personally like to stay away sometimes from those bigger sites and just wander, even if it's not Venice, like wander around, follow my own gut and see where it takes me and enjoy whatever it is that I've found. But in Rome particular, yeah, I definitely think the Catacombs of Priscilla, I'm telling everyone I know to go there.
I love it. Well, I'm definitely adding that to the list for when I'm there in May. And I also just want to say thank you so much, Robyn, for joining us tonight. This has been so much fun and it's such a great resource, and I'm excited for people to continue to benefit from it um, for all time to come, maybe. So thank
Yeah,
you.
great to be here. Thanks, everyone. I was happy to share a big overview of what you can do in Italy.
All right. Well, thank you, Robyn, and I hope you have a good night. All right, everyone. Well, that wraps up night 7 of our 8-day festival. We will be back tomorrow with Rick. He will be closing out the festival with the grand finale, Rick Steves Tours, What Makes Them So Dang Good. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in and happy travels.